All right, let's get started. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to be here. I know there's lots of good options here, and it's a great conference. Today we're going to be talking about really talking about APIs and kind of achieving API excellence at your company and how you can implement an API platform to do that. This is something that I've kind of worked on in previous roles. It's really near and dear to my work. Lots of mistakes I've made, some things I've done well. So hopefully you can get some useful stuff out of it, and we can have a little discussion at the end. Before we jump into all the content, a little overview on myself. I'm Ryan. I'm an engineer at Speakeasy right now. We're kind of focused on building products for an API experience. Before that, I worked at Bolt, the checkout company, not the car company, and worked on leading the embedded API kind of product team and also Bolt's API platform team. So kind of saw a lot of the challenges of scale API development firsthand. Also got to work with a lot of APIs in fintech. Definitely some familiar faces here at the conference. Let's start with why great APIs matter. I don't think I really need to sell this to this group, right? Obviously, APIs are a super critical part of the fintech space, fintech infrastructure. So I'm sure everybody kind of already knows that. But we'll just do a little bit of level setting kind of to get ready for the rest of the talk. To start, for external developers, APIs are a really critical product surface area, both for growing revenue and kind of gaining adoption in your product. And I think this is true whether you're a product that literally sells an API or whether you're a product where an API is kind of the distribution channel to get them to implement you. Really kind of setting the kind of mindset internally that the APIs are the actual product and are not just a means to a product, I think is super important to any kind of good API governance or management going forward. This is something that I've had to do in the past. It's really kind of hard to change that mindset about how you develop APIs, but when you do, it really pays dividends for your company. Obviously, that's for external developers, and that's a huge piece of what we're going to talk about. But there's also a lot of value to building great APIs for your internal developers too. You improve kind of developer productivity. You can really supercharge the communication between teams, which I think is more relevant today than ever, just with the amount of remote work, globally distributed teams. They just give you a more consistent medium for communication that's a lot faster and more reliable than communicating manually. I think a good analogy is I grew up playing soccer, and a coach would always tell me the ball moves faster when you pass it versus when you dribble it, right? And APIs are a similar thing to that, right? You're always going to have a better kind of form of communication when it's schema, when it's contract versus relying on maybe more manual things. So yeah, obviously great APIs are important. Unfortunately, the rub is developer-friendly APIs are super hard to maintain. You have a million different things you need to worry about: compatibility, idempotency, kind of consistent design. And unfortunately, it's not something where you just build it once and you forget it, right? Even if you have a great API today, as your company scales to 10x tomorrow, you have a ton more teams. Maintaining the quality of that is just going to get harder and harder, right? So it's something you constantly need to be thinking about if you kind of want to achieve this area of API excellence. Yep, so today we're going to talk about a solution, right? How do you solve this problem of kind of setting yourself up for success with your API and really kind of setting that up to work no matter what scale your business is at, who your personnel is, what frameworks you're using, what technology you're using. And really the solution to that is kind of building out an API platform. So this is a useful little kind of Figma diagram we have here. We're not going to dive into all the different boxes and circles. But one thing I do want to call out is kind of the three different big rocks that we'll talk about, and these are color-coded. So the blue here is kind of what I call API governance, and that'll be the first section we kind of dive into. Green is really kind of change management, evolution, how do you evolve your API over time in a scalable way. And purple would be kind of our consumer experience, what a lot of people would call DevX. So how do you really provide a great DevX for your customers, whether those are internal or external customers? So yeah, going into an API platform, right? What really is an API platform, and kind of how do you implement that? So in my mind, kind of with what I've experienced, right, it's either a team or a group of people that's dedicated to guiding the quality of your API, and that builds the actual tools necessary to maintain that quality. In my previous role, we had a dedicated platform team that did this, and that was all we focused on. But you don't have to do that at your company, right? You could have a group of engineers from a bunch of different teams that come together and are ambassadors and kind of guide that quality. Some companies have, API product leads or product managers that then are going to form teams under them that kind of focus on this. I think the mechanism of how you do this is not that important, right? It really depends on your org. What's more important is you have a dedicated group of people that's really focused on this stuff. I think governance by committee across the entire company is kind of where things devolve, and you get into a lot of debates around styling and kind of just have trouble maintaining stuff. So this team is going to kind of maintain the technology and processes that your team uses when they build APIs, so that you can think of kind of internal developers as being your customer in that way, and they'll also maintain the tools that your API consumers use. So kind of a bit external as well, a bit of a combo. So here are like some of the key objectives that we're going to talk about, again, kind of covering governance, change management, and kind of consumer DevX. And we'll kind of talk about some different subcomponents of that. Before I dive into it, one more thing I want to add is this is like not an all or nothing thing. We're going to go through a lot of content, and it takes time to implement all of these different subcomponents. But you can still gain a lot of benefit just by taking a few things here. If there's particular areas that resonate with you that you want to implement in your company, it can still really pay dividends for your API quality. So don't think that you have to kind of do everything all at once or bite off the whole problem. It's definitely something that you can do iteratively and solve a lot of problems just by taking things one step at a time. All right, governance. So this is probably what I would say is the most important kind of step to get out from this talk. Governance is really what provides the guardrails to result in a high quality and stable API. I'd say if you do nothing else, take nothing else away from this, just setting up the process to understand changes to your API, govern the design, and kind of monitor that is really probably the most important thing you can do in your company to really build a quality API. This is really the foundation of the entire platform, right? If you don't have this, you can't do any of the other stuff we're going to talk about. And the kind of things you need to kind of install governance, right, is you need a source of truth, which is normally a spec, right, we'll talk about that. You need kind of the ability to review changes and have standards that you apply broadly across your company. And then you need to kind of set up automation off of that for important components of development like change logs, compatibility, and we'll get into all of that. So as I said, kind of the first step is the spec, though. You can't really do anything else if you don't have visibility into what's going on in your API, right? You need to know what's changing, and you need to have some sort of schema that defined what changed in a reasonable way. So we'll talk a bit about that. I think as a caveat, I'm going to be talking mostly about REST here, since I think that's still probably the dominant kind of framework in at least external APIs, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But if you're a GraphQL shop, or if you use gRPC internally and expose REST externally, there's still a ton of stuff that you can take away from this talk. A lot of the kind of tenets of review and design and change is really the same, regardless of what you're using. So if you're using REST, I think the first thing that you need to do, right, is have some sort of spec as a source of truth. There's a couple different options that you have in front of you, right? OpenAPI is probably the big one, and this is what I'm going to talk about the most and what I've used in the past. It's definitely, I think, what has the most community support, most integrations built off of it. So you're kind of setting up yourself for success going with that. But there is RAML, there's JSON API, there's JSON schema. There's lots of stuff out there if you kind of choose to use something different in your org, and that's totally okay. So going off of the spec, I think one thing that I really recommend, right, is that you actually generate this from the source of truth, which is your source code. When you hand maintain these kind of things, they just naturally get out of sync. Speaking as an engineer, people are really bad at updating documentation, right? It's never something that you think about doing. You always want to build the feature, and then you'll get to it eventually, right? And eventually means 2 weeks, and you forget about that Asana task, and then 2 weeks means a month, and before you know it, it's way out of date. So if you can just generate this directly from source code, I really, really recommend doing that. There's a couple different ways you might do this. There's the spec to server approach where you kind of generate your servers from an actual specification. This can be great. There's great tools for this. OpenAPI code gen, gRPC gateway is really awesome if you like writing kind of protocol buffers. But I think for larger companies and ones that already have an established development process, it's really hard to kind of back your way into that. So sometimes that's not really viable, and that's totally okay. The server to spec approach is also really viable as well. There's a ton of frameworks out there for any language you name it. Python with Fast API and Flask. You got Express for JavaScript. There's a ton of integrations off of these server frameworks, right, where you can generate specs from them. Or even if you don't have something that comes out of the box, you can build this internally. That's what I did at my previous company. It takes a bit of a lift up front, but it kind of is good long term. I guess last thing to add on this slide is I did just say it's really important to kind of maintain this directly from source code. With that said, if you have a hand-maintained spec and you update it a week after you make your API change, as long as you're doing that before you actually release your API to your customers, which is basically telling them about the change, you still can gain a lot from this, right? It doesn't mean if you don't have like a generated spec, you shouldn't do the rest of these kind of processes that we're going to talk about. So again, not something that's all or nothing, but more a best practice in my mind. So now that you have a spec, like we'll kind of start talking about what you can do with that, right? I think the first thing that's really big is setting your standards and kind of your process for review of an API. So this group, this kind of platform that you've defined, whether that's a group of engineers, whether that's a combination of product and engineering, whether that's a team, should be reviewing specs for new APIs, which really should be like a technical design or an RFC, depending on kind of how you operate in your company. Should have code ownership even over small changes. Basically, every change should have some level of visibility into it. And I think the last thing I would add here is you don't want this team to just become like a gatekeeper, right? They shouldn't be making it incredibly more difficult on developers to do their job. It should be a value add, right? It should maybe be some increased friction when it comes to releasing, but at the same time should be a lot easier for developers to make a quality API and kind of understand what's going on in the rest of the company. Another way to do this that can be really helpful is set up as much automated linting as possible. So there's a lot of great tools out there like kind of Vacuum, Spectral, where you can define these rules for your company's API and just set up linting directly on your spec, right? So rather than someone reviewing it and some kind of senior engineer or platform person saying, oh, this is wrong and these are all the things you need to change and frustrating the developer, if you automate that and just have those rules come in consistently, it's often less frustrating and also gives people the power to work through issues independently, right? They can adjust, they can fix things. You don't need to be involving everyone's time to kind of get to the state you want to. So definitely, I think that's huge and really valuable. So when it comes to standards, I'm actually not going to touch on this too much because I don't think it matters that much, but I listed some of my go-to REST standards, I guess. I'm a big fan of using all of the actual HTTP methods as verbs, your gets, your puts, your deletes, although I know a bunch of people, especially in this industry, actually that like using posts for everything. That's fine if you like that. Just some styling stuff on how you do your nouns and kind of your casing, paying attention to status codes, especially when it comes to consistency for the types of errors you're dealing with is really important. A couple things for fintech, I think highly recommend you define money as actual integers with currency attached. Even if you don't do multi-currency at this time, you might present or settle in multiple currencies eventually, set yourself up for the long term. Date times are also like my personal pet peeve. I really like readable dates that are strings. I think one of the biggest parts of an API is not just that a computer is supposed to be able to understand it, but a human's also supposed to be able to read it too. So yeah, these are just some things I like to do. With that said, it actually doesn't really matter in my mind. Like everyone has different standards. Everybody has different kind of like mechanisms that they have for their company's API. As a consumer, I don't care what you do as long as it's consistent, right? So the consistency to me is like the most important function of API governance. And like, why do we need things to be consistent, right? Well, I think a big thing just in kind of the integration and sales processes, if your API is perceived as being difficult to use, you can lose a lot of deals that way, right? And consistency, early on at least, is probably what has the most impact on the perception of your API. For consumers, any consistency looks professional and kind of creates trust. It also makes like the work that your kind of consumers are doing really reusable, right? So you can kind of upsell your API usage over time. If they're using you for a particular area of the product, and they've already built out an integration for this product, if your implementation is consistent and you want to extend that to other APIs in your company, and if a lot of the boilerplate's already there, you can really kind of have diminishing integration work over time. So that's really a key benefit of having a consistent API. For the producer side, the people that are actually writing it, consistent will be faster design and development cycles, right? You can kind of avoid bugs that you had in the past in the future by just ensuring that you have certain standards that kind of avoid that pattern. And you just don't need to reinvent the wheel every time for your API, right? You have certain components that already exist. People can pull those in. And just generally creates a better development experience. A little example, I think, of naming, right, in APIs and how consistency can be really, really granular, I guess. On the left here, we have like an example of kind of inconsistent naming. We have like an account number for an account object, right? And you see it's named differently across all, in the left column, right, it's named differently across all APIs. On the right, they keep it consistent. As a consumer, right, that just makes it easy for me to understand what I'm dealing with, understand kind of what this concept is of the business I'm integrating into. The example on the right is like inconsistent naming for a type, right? That's another great thing you can get from consistency, right? Without even looking at documentation. If naming is kind of similar, right, I kind of know what I'm dealing with, right? I know, okay, I'm dealing with a date. and I know what this company's date looks like, and I know how to process that. So just small things of how, how really kind of specific you can get when it comes to consistency. Another great way to kind of like enforce this in your company is by having a shared component library. I think people kind of work on the front end here, like shared React component libraries is really common, right? And something that we've done in the past that I think is really valuable is basically do the same thing for your API and manage that at the platform level. For example, if you have like a payment object in your company, right, that payment object should be centrally defined, and any API that relies on that should be sharing it from the same place, right? So when you make adjustments, those all propagate to every API with one code change. You can kind of avoid major backward incompatibility between services, between downstream data models, and it just makes it a lot easier as a developer to make those changes and kind of push them through the entire system. For external developers, having that kind of component library that's defined on your API and even in your documentation makes it really easy to understand the product, right? One of the biggest things of kind of integrating into a product is understanding what objects are key to that product, right? Is it a transaction? Is it a payment? Is it a cart? And having that component library is huge. All right, so we just went through governance, and now we're going to kind of talk about change management, right? So how do you evolve your API over time? How do you ensure this consistent quality and stability? So I think especially in fintech, early stage products are going to see really rapid changes in API design, right? Your customers are going to change, the market segment of your customers are going to change, maybe you change your product entirely. You just kind of have to expect that this iteration happens. As your business grows, you hire more people, you gain, maybe you go more up market or you go wider for self-service. Your API is going to change too. More products, more integration pathways, maybe more kind of partnerships is going to lead to more sprawl in your API. And as your surface area grows, maintaining this consistency and kind of publishing safely, and what we talked about previously, is just going to get harder and harder, right? And that's just a fact, right? The more distribution you have, the harder it is to make things kind of centralized and consistent. So setting yourself up for success here early on is huge. First thing we'll talk about is backward compatibility, and I guess we can do a fun little story that I wasn't directly involved in for this one. I've definitely had bad experiences with backward incompatible changes myself in my own companies, but I like this one. So it's a quick story on Uber Eats India and how a backward incompatible change can wreak havoc on a product. Basically, it's 3 steps. Step 1 is Uber Eats is using a payment vendor who happened to make a backward incompatible change to their kind of payment API on a Friday nonetheless, so nobody was there. Uber Eats was kind of depending on this API being idempotent. They would charge it, they would try to charge, they'd get an error, then they'd try again, they would expect the same error, and great, didn't have money. When the change happened, they'd try to charge once, they'd get 1 error, they'd charge again, and because it was no longer idempotent, they'd get something else. Now, I don't know why they developed their system this way, but unfortunately, basically they always expected the same error to come back. If anything else came back that wasn't that error, they just assumed the charge was successful. So as you can imagine, this basically led to a bunch of people getting their food for free, which I think lasted for over 24 hours, bunch of lost revenue. I don't know exactly how they recouped all those funds, but one of the big debates in the community coming out of this was like, whose fault is this, right? Is this the producer's fault who made a backward incompatible change to their API? Or is this the consumer's fault who kind of was integrating in maybe a not super safe way? And it's probably a bit of shared blame, but I think generally what the community found, and also what I would contend as well, is like as a producer, backward compatibility is your responsibility, and they kind of broke this here. So obviously almost a cardinal sin, I think, for a fintech API. So as I said, this is like probably one of the biggest things in a fintech API. Your compatibility must be bulletproof. The second you make a breaking change, that's kind of when trust is lost in your API, when your competitors are going to be able to swoop in. For internal APIs, it's a bit different. I think you can get away with a bit of backward incompatibility with orchestration, right? You can make a change and then have a different team make a change on the front-end app and coordinate your deployments in a timed way. The problem is when you rely fully on like manual communication for that, that's when things get scary. It's really easy for someone to mess something up, and that's how you take down your apps. Definitely have done that before. So really kind of setting up an automated way of enforcing backward compatibility is huge. And this is kind of something you now have the ability to do now that you can track this source of truth. So yeah, my thing is kind of put your API change detection to use, set up static automated backward compatibility checks. Now that you have a spec, there's a ton of great things you can use to do this. There's OpenAPI diff, OAuth diff, which will do great kind of reports on changes you've made to your API. For your internal apps, you can kind of look more at actually what the client is using and at what the server is using to make sure that they're in line. And then there's lots of things that you can't do with static checks, right? We talked about idempotency, error, like consistent errors, pagination, all those kind of things. And that's really where you should rely on integration testing, right? You need to make sure when these API changes are rolling out that you're testing the failure cases, you're testing the more kind of obscure areas of it, and that you're monitoring basically what's going on in release. I guess last kind of mention here is there's also kind of up-and-coming products around anomaly detection. I used to use Datadog Watchdog a little bit for this, if anyone has Datadog, and actually can do some useful stuff with just generally looking for kind of diverging schemas or diverging kind of types of errors that you're seeing in your API, although it's still a little bit early. Another big part of like change management is avoiding bloat to your API. I think this is a really big problem, especially in fintech, both with APIs I've developed, APIs I've consumed. There's definitely a big kind of push around never, basically only adding to your API, right? And while that can help with backward compatibility, it leads to a really bloated API surface area. And I think the reason this is a problem, another kind of analogy, right, is I built a TV stand earlier this week. And the TV stand came and had a ton of parts, it had a ton of screws, it had like twice as many parts as it actually needed to assemble, right? And just because they probably thought it'd be good for me to have, backups and have more things than I need, but just because I had all that, I was super distracted and actually it was harder for me to build it. I think a bloated API is very similar, right? When you have more fields, more kind of components than the user actually needs to integrate, they just naturally get distracted and it leads to a worse integration experience. And this typically happens as when you evolve, when you kind of overload a single API, right? So you're kind of building the universal API internally to an extent, and then you throw a bunch of products into the same thing, and all of a sudden it becomes kind of like a Frankenstein. I've dealt with APIs that have like 500 fields, and then customers are only using 20 of them, right? So you have another 480 that are just sitting there, and maybe one customer is using it, and before you know it, it's a nightmare to maintain and a nightmare for someone to integrate into. Documentation can help solve this problem, but I think it's a bit of a Band-Aid. In general, like customers and engineers will always get distracted. So if you give them more information than they need, they're gonna ask you what something is. They're gonna find some field in the response that they don't need. It's gonna lead to frustration for you because you're gonna have to explain yourself, kind of whether it's over a Slack channel, whether it's over a call, and it's gonna slow down their integration. And I think one of the biggest things you wanna gain from like a good DevX and good API experience is faster integration times. So that was the API bloat problem. How do we kind of try to avoid that, right, as we evolve our API? I think one of the biggest things is really trying to stick to like the single responsibility principle, which obviously it's not always possible, but if something seems unrelated to an existing API, you should probably put it in something else, right? Don't just clobber a bunch of things together because it's the easiest way to develop. Try to really make your APIs specific kind of object or product surface areas. Also avoid prematurely generalizing. I know, especially like if you're a connector company that integrates with a lot of things downstream, generalization is kind of your bread and butter. That's what you offer to your customers. But there's also a lot of things where generalization just isn't viable. I think using polymorphism in the right places is really great. I used Adyen's API pretty frequently kind of in my previous role, and I really thought they had like excellent examples of polymorphism in the right kind of areas, so I thought I'd call that out. Metadata is also another great way to kind of provide some customization to your customers, right? Maybe some state that they want to keep throughout different calls, but you don't have to actually modify your API schema by adding a bunch of fields that everybody else needs to worry about, right? You just kind of give control to your customers to manage their own objects. And I think lastly, I'd say the real way to solve this is to not be afraid of backward incompatibility, right? To make changes that actually kind of change the structure of API as it makes sense. Now the problem is we just talked about how bad backward incompatibility is, so how do we kind of take those two things and get past that, right? Which kind of leads me into my next point, which is API versioning. Probably like fairly controversial. I know there's a lot of companies that are really into not doing versioning at all and just kind of continually managing the same API. That's what I've done in the past, and I think it's probably one of the bigger mistakes. My advice would be bite the bullet on versioning. It definitely is a big lift. It takes a lot of effort to do well at first, but it's gonna be so worth it over time. Advantage-wise, it's gonna allow you to involve your API over time as your business changes, right? You may have certain things that just don't make sense anymore, and instead of having to leave them around in perpetuity, you can actually make adjustments and change your schema over time that makes it as easy to use as possible for your modern consumers. When it comes to implementing versioning, there's a lot of different ways to execute it. I think the number one thing you want to do is have a regular release cadence, right? You don't want it to be random for your customers. You want them to know when a version release is coming out, know how to track a changelog of what's going to be in that. But you can have different levels of granularity when it comes to how you version, right? The easiest way is just kind of do like path-based versioning that has v1, v2, downstreams to different handlers. Maybe you handle that at like an API gateway, right, where you actually parse that and then even potentially go to different services. And you can implement that pretty quickly. And you can even kind of like install path versions in your API, even if you don't version right now, just to set yourself up for the possibility in the future. Obviously, you know, there's companies that take versioning the extra mile. I think Stripe's a really good example, right, with their rolling versioning. That's super impressive and a big lift, right, where you can kind of like backward kind of adjust schemas from the current version to whatever you want to go to. Everything is like fully numerically comparable. It's a really, really well built out system. So if you want to go do that, it's going to be a big engineering lift at first, but again, it really sets you up for success in the long term. So another big part of versioning is deprecation, right? Even if you've solved the bloat problem and you now have a perfect API for your consumers that are coming in, if you never deprecate anything, right, you're going to be left with 70 versions of your API and one really old customer on some super legacy version that maybe isn't a problem for them, but it's definitely going to be a problem for your engineers to kind of support that, right, and to kind of maintain that and make sure they don't break that long term. I will say deprecation is really hard for companies that have external APIs, and sometimes it's just like not viable. But it is something you should try and kind of like gauge your customers to see if you can do it. The best way to do it is just organically guide your customers to upgrading. Like this can be done by marketing new API features. Maybe there's some new kind of like product that's available to them, some additional stability, kind of really sell them on why they want to take the engineering effort to upgrade, right? I think another important thing of this, right, is telemetry. You need to actually know what your customers are using, right? You should know what version every customer is on. You should know what actual fields people use within an API. If you can get that granular, that really helps you out. And lastly, if you really care about someone moving up a version and you really care about deprecation, you might just need to incentivize your customers, right? If it matters to you, make it matter to them. The best way to do that's normally money, whether that's some sort of contract discount, you give them some temporary credits, just any sort of kind of incentive to give someone a timeline and actually make something concrete that someone needs to upgrade. Last kind of section for this API kind of evolution problem is API ownership. I think this is a huge thing that often goes underlooked. A big problem in more mature companies, right, is you have these like super APIs that were built a long time ago, and they're just kind of owned by everybody. But the problem is when everybody owns something, no one owns it. So I think a big thing to solve is really the ownership problem. Every API should have a clear owning team. And this can be really big for things like incidents, right, where you can very clearly find the right people to get a problem in front of. The way I've solved this in the past was very easy to build and really useful, is just decorating code with API owners, kind of as like an attribute on the API definition itself. And it's really kind of a piece of cake to do that, right? You implement it. When someone adds a new API, you just make it so that they can't do it without adding a team owner. And there's a ton of great things you can do with that. You can generate like a directory of your APIs where basically anybody can go in, search for an API, understand what team or what group of people is the expert in that area. You can start auto-generating monitoring and alerting, right? So you generate monitors that the alerts just automatically go to the right team, right? In an incident, the right team's always tagged. You don't need to do that dance to figure out who owns something or who knows about something. Honestly, this is like something you can implement really fast, and I think maybe one of the most successful things that I've done in the past. All right. I'm going to jump into the last section here, which is kind of delighting your API consumers, or what people normally refer to as like DevX. Probably the one I like the best. I think what I'd say is even if you have a great API, you have to have a great DevX to pair with it, right? It's kind of just you're not doing yourself a service if you don't. So I think a great developer experience is really important to winning you over customers, but actually more important than that is you can really make evangelists of the customers that you do have, right? And that's really powerful when you kind of create a developer brand for yourself and you can actually have your customers sell on behalf of you. And I think what's often a misconception is kind of API platform teams or people at the platform level don't work as much in an external capacity, but you still have the power to like invest in a lot of these technical areas that affect the external DevX, right? The DevX of the consumer. Yeah, and last thing I'd add here is like, again, customers aren't always just external developers, right? It could be that you have a very distributed org and it's a bunch of other teams in your org are actually consuming your API. They're still your consumers, right? They still need a DevX as well. And providing them kind of a valuable, tool to basically use your API is still really valuable there. So obviously, DevX is super big for external developers, but I would say don't skimp on it, even if you're only developing an API for internal users. The first part of DevX, which everyone knows, API docs. Your docs are really the UX of your API. We'll say is like a good doc really won't paper over a bad API, right? You can't document your way out of a bad API, but if you have bad docs, you can kind of ruin a good API. Out-of-sync docs are probably one of the most frustrating things and biggest net negatives for developers, right? When what exists in documentation doesn't actually match what they're seeing on schema or seeing in usage. It's a huge frustration, leads to lost trust, lost time, kind of a disaster. And a big thing from having this platform now is, right, manually keeping your docs in sync will normally fail. We talked about developers hate documenting stuff. Again, same problem, right? Someone's gonna change something, they're gonna push off the documentation as long as possible, and it's gonna become a big mess to try to coordinate all of that. But now that you have this kind of change management process and the ability to detect changes, you can start automating a lot of this, right? I think a lot of companies, I'm sure people use tools like this at their company, whether it's Redoc or Slate or README. There's a bunch of companies where you can auto-generate documentation from a spec, right? And that's a great way to release your documentation. If you could just go directly from your source code to docs, that's awesome. For mature companies, I know a lot probably don't do that because they have technical writing teams and other kind of organizations which may be outside of engineering that are also very involved in that process, right? Maybe they annotate the API with examples or they add better copy, better descriptions. And that's totally okay too, and that's normal. I think one of the biggest consumers of like our API platform team in the past was actually our technical writers. They were kind of a big customer. And what you can do with them, right, is you can really generate automation to meet them where they're at, right? Whether they're using GitHub or they're using some other tool to kind of manage their docs, could be Vercel, could be they have Asana tickets that show up and they do something else. You can really use automation to loop them in at the right time, right? Set up some sort of Zapier workflow, trigger something for the technical writers. They'll know exactly when they need to update something. They won't need to be chasing down engineers to figure out what changed, and they'll know exactly who to talk to. I think it creates a really smooth workflow, and they can be big benefactors of the work that engineering does. Another big part of docs is recipes. I won't go through this whole thing, but I think this is really just to show how kind of confusing even a simple API can be to implement, right? Especially in fintech, you're rarely dealing with just a single API call when you're doing an integration. Most products require you to chain together multiple calls at the right time in the right sequence, and like an API reference itself just doesn't tell the whole story. And no matter how simple you think your product is, it ends up creating a pretty complicated decision tree. Here I just drew up a basic diagram of someone authorizing a payment and different actions that you might do depending on what the user does with capturing and voiding and refunding. The decision tree gets complicated, and for someone that actually doesn't know your product as well as you, it's even more complicated, right? So giving them hand-holding resources that can guide them in a scalable way is really powerful, and I think that's where recipes come into play. So if you're going to invest in documentation, having some subset of preset recipes that define how you do a certain workflow, and maybe even a language-specific one, is really valuable and can really help your developers. One of the more challenging parts of DevX is actually like gauging how you're doing. I think it's really hard to find good metrics to really understand if your DevX is a positive or not. A really popular one is time to 200. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't track that, like it's an okay one to track and it's easy to track. But I do think it's a little overdone and it's probably an incomplete metric for kind of what DevX actually is. The goal of your API isn't necessarily for someone just to use it really quickly or for someone to be able to like find your product quickly. It's actually to distribute your product, right? It's for them to be able to build a smooth, bug-free integration at the end of the day. And focusing on metrics that are just at the start of that point kind of doesn't tell the whole story. So in general, I'd like to focus on metrics that kind of comprehensively represent the API integration. In the past, like a developer NPS report where you send out a survey after an integration can be really valuable. Similar stuff, the companies that do like API usability scores. But at the end of the day, you should just find something that actually is a picture on the entire integration, right? And really try to ensure that developers have a positive outlook on your company after they've completed something rather than just starting it. I realize that these are pretty like qualitative and sometimes that can be difficult. If you want to pair it with something more quantitative, something we've done in the past is track like API error rate in the first X days of an integration. You can just kind of compare that across your customer base and trying to get an understanding of maybe who struggled, who didn't struggle, and kind of track how things are going via that. I think another great thing you can provide to DevX is SDKs. And as you kind of build out a better spec management process, like this is something that becomes more and more viable to you. It's really a next level layer on your API experience that really can provide a lot of value to developers by meeting them where they're at, right? We talked about recipes a little bit. You can kind of create these guided experiences that naturally kind of push people to build what you want them to build rather than them having to figure that out for themselves. For external developers, there's a ton of benefits, right? To start, you can get all the boilerplate stuff out of the way, things like retries in the client, and pagination, idempotency. Rather than them having to figure out how you build that in your system, it can already be there for them in their native language. And that saves time, can lead to faster integrations, and that's kind of what everybody wants. You also, just having types alone reduces the room for error, right? Even if you have a perfect API, perfect documentation, people just don't read stuff. Like, that's just a thing. So people are gonna make mistakes, right? Someone's gonna think your monetary field's a string and it's actually an integer, and it's just gonna slow them down, right? So if you can have like native types in their language, it basically makes it impossible for them to make those mistakes. And the last thing that I think is really big for external developers is the telemetry part, right? How do you understand actually how your people are using your API, right? Who is using what? How are they making these calls? Having an SDK where you can kind of embed telemetry into it is really valuable for that and can help you a lot. Some more benefits for internal developers. Again, sharing like information natively between teams is huge. I think another really great thing you can do internally is if you have a group of APIs, but they're only relevant to certain teams, you can kind of package those into team-dependent SDKs and really deliver information that way. And again, when it comes to the schema management, you know exactly what's happening on the client and exactly what's happening on the server at the same time. So it makes kind of deploys, backward compatibility, bulletproof at that point. There's a lot of different ways to do SDKs. I mean, hand rolling's a big thing. It does take a lot of time to kind of like build SDKs customly in each language. And teams that do that typically have like actual kind of teams that just work on SDKs. There's some great open source options. Also a lot of vendors out there. And that's something that you can do when you have a spec. This is something that's near and dear to me, but a ton of different options. And that's kind of, I think, the main stuff on DevX. So yeah, thanks. That was most of the presentation. We'll definitely jump into some questions. I guess before I do that, just want to, again, thank everyone for coming. Hope you got something out of this. And also thank you to the conference organizers for putting all this together. It's been really great. If you want to chat about anything here, or you just want to chat about APIs, kind of your take on the industry, I love to chat. Left my contact information right there. I'll also be over at the Speakeasy booth all week, as will everybody else from the Speakeasy team. So come chat with us, just if you want to talk about APIs. With that, I think if anybody has questions, I think we have a good couple, maybe 5 minutes or so for questions. Thanks. This slide? Yeah. Yeah, so how we did that. Yeah, I think I'm supposed to repeat the question. So it was about kind of basically error rate in first X days and if that was per integrator and kind of how you track that. So how we did that typically was actually after the first time to live, and we'd look at it for like the first 15 days typically, and kind of a subset of key APIs, so like our payments API, our card API, and get an understanding of like, literally just what their error rate is, right? And typically for ones that had higher error rates, that would mean there was more things in their integration that did not go well, right? So you can kind of track that over time, compare what customers had a better, smoother developer experience than others, and also ideally bring that down over time. Yeah, you need some way to tie it to a specific customer. So typically API key, I think specifically what I've seen is sometimes a combination of two keys. You'll have like an API key, which might be a secret key, and then like a public identifier, right, for unauthenticated calls or calls that may come from the browser. And that's kind of how you can just, on your back end, tie that all together and figure out what customer is making this call. Yeah. Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I think SDKs are a major value add in my mind, right? They are kind of basically providing that tailored developer experience, and I think as you mature, it's kind of a no-brainer, especially if you can get it for pretty easy work with kind of a good spec. But you can definitely, develop a high-quality REST API and just have people make their own clients. I think it's just like different levels of the experience. Yeah. Auto-generating I mean, you put it in the slides, man. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have. I mean, I think just evaluate the market. Obviously, we'd love for you to come talk to us at Speakeasy, but there's really a lot of options out there. So just try stuff out. It's easy. They're normally easy to try, and you kind of play around with it. I think actually my advice for evaluating is take it from a developer's perspective, right? Don't think about it as this is my company, this is my API, like I wanna see how this looks to me. Like kind of back up and be, if I'm integrating, right, and I'm trying to build into my product, what's this workflow look like for me? And really try to step out of your role as like an employee of your company and more step into the role of your consumer. One of the things, yes, yeah. So we'd love for you to talk to us, but don't want to turn it into a pitch, yeah. Yeah, so we focus a lot on kind of like API management right now. So like focusing on how you manage your spec, how you kind of like enforce certain workflows to happen. So it's mostly kind of post design that we're working on right now. Yeah.
You automatically generate your documentation and so forth from implementing code, and your governance team needs to like review changes. Do you find that people end up having to write a lot of code before they can get governance, and then maybe be asked to do a lot of pre-work?
Yeah, I think so. It depends a bit on what the workflow looks like, right? If you have it generate alongside the actual code itself, it kind of all comes in one PR. So in that case, it's almost just like you're getting a normal code review, right? It's just rather than like kind of parsing through a bunch of Go code, right? And being like, okay, what does this API look like? Trying to parse through a bunch of structs. You'll like just have a reference, right? Which is a very clear like schema-defined language to understand what's going on. So in that case, I don't think it causes like much more friction because it's the same as a normal code review. If you do it after the fact, it can provide a bit more friction, right? Because you're building the actual kind of server code, the API, and then you're having the spec reviewed, and then you have to go back. With that said, most of like development isn't building like the actual surface area, right? It's like all the internals, all the things that the API does. So even if you have to ask someone to change like how they structured something from its presentation layer, it's normally not like an insane ask, right? I don't imagine for almost anything you're asking a developer to do something that would take them more than one day if they're just restructuring that layer. Any other questions? Or disagreements, also open to that as well. Yep, yeah, CodeGen. It depends on how many and kind of size and stuff like that, yeah. You're talking to the engineer, so I'm probably not the best to talk to you about that. Did you have another question? Oh yeah, he was just asking about how kind of like the generated SDKs work from a spec, and it's basically just a CodeGen process of like defining a kind of a representation in code of an API that's like an AST, and then basically going and generating a bunch of stuff from that, yeah. Exactly, and that's a big benefit, I think, of whether you're using something open source for this, whether you're using a vendor, right? And I think that can be like a downfall of handwriting it, right? Is that it's not just like the initial cost to do that, right? You have to like have someone that's always maintaining this forever, and people leave the company, people change teams, it gets really hard to like retain context. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, there's two sides of it, right? There's like the consumer side and producer side. I guess keep forgetting to repeat the question. The question was whether, given the buzz around AI, whether I see like kind of intersections between AI and kind of this API workflow, API governance problem. And kind of from the consumer and producer side, I think AI is actually one of the biggest consumers of APIs, right? That's like a lot of models today and a lot of kind of integrations with models is all based off of API and more specifically REST APIs at this point. So kind of exposing yourself via a clean API that not just a human could understand, but like a model could understand really can set you up for a lot of possibilities there. From the actual producer side, yeah, there's definitely a lot of applications. I think just looking at things like standards alone, right? When you're trying to define like a standard for your API and have this like group of reviewers that look over things, I definitely think we could be at a point in the near future, right, where you set up some sort of general guidelines and you have just an AI workflow that entirely manages the review of your spec, right? Because it's really just a document that it processes. And it actually could probably do some things better than a human could, right? When it's trying to get an understanding of like, oh, someone's like writing a date, right? And we tend to write dates that look like this, right? a human needs to like say, okay, what are all the APIs we've written? What does this look like? AI can kind of crunch that a lot faster. So I definitely think there's going to be applications in the near future just processing documents and kind of providing, feedback or information on that. Any other ones? All right, awesome. I think one more thing I'd add is I did add a couple resources slides here. If you just want to look into any of this tools or stuff that I mentioned, this will link out to it. I think they'll give these presentations out. If they don't, you have my contact information. Just ping me, and I'll just add you on the presentation. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the conference.